19th century, the 18th century as a moment of transition also was an important part of the argument of solitary sex, a cultural history of masturbation, which came out in 2004, which is the topic of his paper tonight. We'll be revisiting that work on solitary sex. I'd just like to say his most recent book is The Work of the Dead, A Cultural History of Mortal Remains, published in 2015. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Tom. Our plan is to, he's going to talk for 45 minutes or so, or as long as he likes, obviously. Then we'll have a short break in which those of us in the room will have a glass of wine, and we'll come back for questions. People online, if you want to ask questions, then you can put them in the chat and we can read them out, and people in the room get to see them in person. Okay, now I'm going to pass my laptop over to Tom. So it's goodbye from me.
I don't have to do anything, right? Just the camera.
Yeah.
So thank you for the introduction, and to the 18th Century Studies Group and to the Solitude Group, thank you for the invitation. In the context of why the people who invited me, this is going to focus on the 18th century. There's a great deal more than one could say about the subject. One could consider the redemptive history of masturbation, the sort of self-discovery that you get in some feminist texts like Our Bodies, Ourselves. One could talk about art projects which deal with both the redemptive side and the abject side. And Vito Visconti, the artist, who on one hand masturbated under the stage of a museum for a week, while people walked over his head, and on the other hand did a project in which he pulled himself over broken glass. And one might think of a connection in one artist in these two projects. So there's many kinds of ways that one could go in this project in its 20th century version, but I'm not going to do that. I want to focus on the earlier history. And before revisiting solitary sex, I thought I might visit it on the assumption that everyone has read the book. And in visiting it, I could add some maybe things that count as revisit before a formal revisit section near the end. So the project actually started when a distinguished 18th century historian of medicine, Roy Porter, invited me to give a talk a very long time ago. And I understood this as I needed a topic in the history of medicine. And so I decided I was going to ask the question, why is it that on or about 1712, masturbation came to be regarded for the first time as the cause of a great number of physical and mental illnesses? The place where this happened is quite precisely in a tract called Onania, or the heinous sin of self-pollution, and all its frightful consequences in both sexes, considered with spiritual and physical advice to those who have already injured themselves by this abominable practice, and a sensible admonition to the youth of the nation of Britain of those sexes. So, what is the actual problem? What is the practice that's at stake? It's the unnatural practice by which persons of either sex may defile their own bodies without the assistance of others. While yielding to filthy imagination, they endeavor to imitate and procure for themselves that sensation which God says ordered to attend the carnal commerce of the two sexes for the continuance of their species. So there were all sorts of diseases that followed. Some of these diseases were explicitly connected with matters sexual, but many of them weren't. So he lists a series throughout this pamphlet, which grew over the years for reasons which I'll come to in a moment. But phimosis or paraphimosis, which is problems with the foreskin, sexual, fainting spells or epilepsies, hysteric fits, barrenness, yes, violent vapors, which people know vapors is a very capacious term in this period, but mood swings we call depression, bipolar, mental issues, all sorts of violent pains in the back and in the head, nocturnal pollutions, an inward trembling in my nerves, a great weakness of pain in my back. In other words, a real dog's body of symptoms connected to what we would now call mental disease, as well as physical disease. And also, by the way, they got the depression, lowness of spirits, troublesome dreams. I mean, pretty much everything. Then by the 19th century, this had grown. Blindness became very common, muscular degeneration, obsessive compulsive disorders, and insanity generally. And the idea of insanity is that actually this is a place where we can find evidence in archives of masturbation as the cause of insanity. That is to say, in asylums for Civil War veterans who were offered medical care by the government, you actually see cause of illness in masturbation. So in other words, this is one of these things where we don't simply rely on normative texts. We actually know that we have records of this diagnosis. We actually have in the 18th century also with Tissot, but in terms of institutionalism, we actually know that aliens identified this as an illness. Okay, so what I started being interested in is just explaining this in the context of explaining new diseases. And historians of medicine were interested in what we would call the cultural construction of disease. So models would be new diseases like syphilis in 1494, which had all sorts of efforts to try to define what was. Known diseases, which got renamed. European Asiatic cholera of 31. The 19th century was full of new packaging of pathology and clinical evidence. This is what history doctors did. So one thinks of Thomas Addison and a whole bunch of symptoms which he connected with pathologies of the adrenal gland or anemias, pernicious anemias, came to be grouped as syndromes. So it became Addison's disease or Addison's syndrome by Maccabees. And then in the 20th century, new packaging of symptoms or diagnosis of exclusions, so chronic fatigue syndrome, repetitive stress disorder, which is sort of a version of 19th century Scrivener's hand, and so forth. So that was my initial move, was to try to figure out, well, this fits into some story of diseases. But masturbation as pathogenic is sort of unique both in the suddenness of its appearance and the variety of illnesses. And so something else had to happen to explain how a nearly universal practice was suddenly thought to explain a huge variety of physical and spiritual ailments. So my interest then turned to the 18th century, and this became essentially an 18th century topic with a penumbra that goes on to Freud and beyond. I think Freud is basically an Enlightenment guy as well. So it's a very long 18th century, if you will, with some falling at the end. And so the story became less rooted in the history of medicine than in the history of print, which I'll come to in a moment, of moral philosophy, and more generally of what you want to think of as the making of the self and what I took to be a largely secular environment. And then revisiting, I want to come back to this question of the secular. So the first order of business in terms of my work was showing that it actually was 18th century. And in some sense, I thought the book was a little bit overkill in that subject, and I spent hundreds of pages trying to make this case. Reviewers still said, why didn't I know that the Christians were really worried about sex and they actually were worried about masturbation? They were not, but 200 pages didn't seem to convince them, so I figured 300 wouldn't have, and 10 would have been just as well. But be that as it may, I'm just going to rehearse for you a little bit of this history that actually was 1712, give or take a few years. First of all, there's nothing in the ancient physicians, except one famous case in which Galen recommends we might take to be masturbation to relieve depression and potential hysterias in women, and a few cases arguing for its healthiness vis-a-vis intercourse. The interesting thing about that is that these classically learned 18th century doctors were surprised and noted that these great physicians of antiquity hadn't noticed what is so self-evident to them. So that in itself seems to be people who actually knew this medical tradition firsthand as still being alive, understood that it didn't speak to what it should be speaking to. And you think of the sin of onan and onanism. Onanism and onan had never been connected with masturbation until this. I went through all these rabbinic comments, and I went through Augustine comments and other comments on Genesis 38:8, and that wasn't the issue. The specific issue in Genesis 38:8 is the problem of succession. And you might remember the first of Judah's sons died, supposedly because he was married to this foreigner, this Tamar, and through levirate practice, the second son, Onan, was called upon to marry Tamar, and Onan then spilled his seed upon the ground. But the rabbis claim that it's some version of intercrural sex or possibly anal sex, and the rabbis said manner of interpretation, but not what we would take to be, or it is recognizable as masturbation. It's only actually in the 19th century that, oddly enough, what the rabbis referred to, which is some version of coitus interruptus, came to be called in church catechisms marital onanism. So there's a weird kind of twist on this version. So Onan really had nothing to do with the story. And there's no mention about it in Christian theologians and clergy or doctors until then. So Foucault has a text that's by Cassian, exists only in manuscript, so no one knew about it till the 20th century, so it's minor. And if you actually read this Cassian text, maybe you could say it's about masturbation, but it certainly doesn't talk about it. It doesn't talk about onanism. So the bottom line of all this is that onanism is invented and connected to onan. And it's specifically defined as what we would take the masturbation to the definition I spoke to you, only in 1712. And in the book, I go into tedious detail about that's not what Thomas Aquinas says, and it's not what, so I spare you all that, but please take the point. Moving right along, so it's invented in 1712, and it's probably by a softcore pornographer and a quack surgeon named John Martin, who was the author of other sort of softcore medical porn books. And in some sense, it creates a market at the same time as it creates a cure. And sells the cure. So it is really a case of your money or your life. So there you have this guy in London. It sells in coffee houses. Primarily, the drug is delivered to coffee houses, and it immediately has both imitators, Aerononia, and that's tied to another quack doctor's Chamberlain's Anatine necklace. Then there's Aerononia Examined, which has the same issue, but with a different title and different sort of person. And it explodes and becomes through edition after edition. And there is real evidence that it actually was sold in coffee houses. I mean, so this is not some rhetorical flourish. This was a guy who made money selling patent medicines by making people that were going to die unless they took his medicine. So you figure, so this becomes the core of this issue, which is, I'll tell you in a moment, absorbs the attention of the Kants and the Rousseaus and the Voltaires and these serious 18th century guys, and the answer is yes. So it's the most remarkable example I know of upward social mobility of literature ever. So between 1712 and the next decades, it makes it the Chambers Encyclopedia, which also says, isn't it remarkable that this guy discovers this terrible disease none of the people in antiquity knew about? And it's in Zedler's Universal Lexicon called Selbstbefleckung, self-pollution, in 1743. And in 1765, it makes it in the encyclopedia, sort of the capstone of the Enlightenment. And again, with the interesting comment that amazing that no one knew about this before. Then it's picked up by the most read and reprinted doctor of the 18th century, a guy named Samuel Auguste David Tissot, whose books are translated into initially all European languages, and by the early 19th century into languages of the rest of the world, and part of the century, the Chinese, the Japanese. Amazingly popular writer, and who was famous for writing books about vaccination, variolation, about epilepsy, about nervous disorders, and about a book on the health of the people, which was first in Latin and then French, which is widely translated and became sort of the popular medical guides of Dawkins' medical guide. And then he published a book called The Onanism. And there are hundreds of editions of this, starting with the Latin edition in 1759. So that's sort of so there it is in little less than 50 years, into all the major encyclopedias, into the works of the most famous doctor of the century, and it gets translated and widely disseminated. So the question, one issue, one thing to point to is that this is really part of this exploding commercial world of print, and of advertising, and of the creation of the desire for a product that no one ever really needed before. So in that sense, it's very much part of a market economy, which I'm going to come to in a moment. So that's sort of the print history of this, a little bit of the medical history. It's interesting to me, what was interesting, Enlightenment parts of this, I mean, high Enlightenment parts of this, is how it is then picked up by the major characters of the Enlightenment who take this as a deeply serious project. So Rousseau in the Emile would be is an obvious example. Rousseau in the Confessions, Rousseau and Tissot were actually good buddies. They were both Genevan. They were both Swiss Protestants. And as you know, in the Emile, Rousseau takes this up as all sorts of things you can cure your people of, but not masturbation. Rousseau also, of course, comes up with the notion that masturbation is not a problem of shortage, but of plenty. The word, the danger of supplement, which is Derrida takes up. Again, it's a problem of too much and not a problem of too little. It becomes an issue in the Berliner Monatsschrift, which were Kant published, which ran a contest for the best essay in demonstrating the evils of masturbation and what we can do about it. So this is, again, you want to say really, but there you are. The guy that wins it is a guy named Zimmerman, who was physician for King and is a major character. Kant takes it up. It takes it as a worse moral evil than suicide, because in suicide, at least the person has a real reason to treat themselves as an object. While masturbation, they create the desire to treat themselves as an object, which of course is the great sin of Kantian deontological ethics. So, and then you can go right in the 20th century with the people like G. Stanley Hall, who develops the concept of adolescence, and Freud. He brought Freud to America, and he founds American psychology, calls it the most perfect vice and sin, calls them a host of nervous and cardiovascular symptoms. So the conclusion to this, and this is sort of surprising because you might have thought this was staying Grub Street instead of going to not Grub Street. The conclusion of all this is that this is not a medical problem, but a moral problem or an ethical problem. And it continued to be that well after it ceases to be a medical problem. So it's still an issue when one reads about sexual ethics and the self in issues of the 20th century. So the question is, how does one explain it? Well, historians of medicine have looked at a whole bunch of 18th century theories of possible explanation. So nerves and sensation, there's a big part in sensation psychology and in sensation novels, and there's a whole world of nerves. It explains how mental states can cause bodily ills, but it doesn't exactly explain why this one is the one that particularly causes the moral and physical collapse. Though it gives a pathophysiology, if you will, of this. There's seminal loss, but of course that doesn't explain why women were so explicitly included and endangered by masturbation. There's generalized excitement. Then the question is, why is this excitement worse than sexual intercourse, which everyone said it was? And then the worst case became the norm. So regular masturbation was understood to lead to obsessive compulsive masturbation, which was taken to be a version of the ordinary practice. So those are all pathophysiological explanations and ways that medicine translates the pathophysiology into these other areas. And of course, if you actually looked at clinical reports, like you look at Tissot left a huge nachlass of cases, which are available in Geneva. And the point is, of course, that patients report symptoms of what doctors say is a problem, And since the doctor will then ask, well, do you masturbate? And since some high percentages people probably do, you have a post-hoc ergo propter hoc, and you have the formation of this syndrome, and patients believe it. So that's the pathophysiology and how it's translated into actual medical clinical practice. To me, what became interesting is that the actual what was actually totally dangerous from Onania through the encyclopedia, through Rousseau and following on was the secrecy, excess, connected with addiction, which is also a 19th century term, and as the encyclopedia says, the fiery imagination. These are not people in the Christian tradition of anti-concupiscence. It's not an Augustinian tradition. It's a tradition which says the issue is not concupiscence as the emanation of the soul of God or the natural desires of the flesh. It's desire produced internally through the imagination, with nothing to stop it endlessly. Hence the dangerous supplement. The problem then, as I came to conceive it, is sort of the evil doppelganger of three Enlightenment values: the value of imagination, of privacy, and the importance of renewable consumer desire. And the problem was that it was not motivated by a real object desire, but by a phantasm. Second, that all other sex was in some versions social, masturbation was private, but when not done alone, it was social in all the wrong ways. And third, unlike other appetites, the urge to masturbate could neither be sated nor moderated. Rousseau makes a big deal saying, well, even in excess sexual intercourse, as he calls it, the idea is that someone is going to call a stop to this. Someone can refuse. There is no refusing. There is no social break in this thing. And since it's secret, no one can speak of the question. In any case. Okay, so it's in that sense into the dark underbelly of much that we value about secular modernity and capitalist behavior. It's connected to the thread of private reading, especially the reading of novels, which is the excitation of desire for novels and dangers for women. And by 1800, it was firmly in place as that which stands against whatever is taken to be the proper relationship between sexuality and society. And this is true even for sexual radicals like Richard Carlile, early birth control advocate, as well as for conservatives. So this is not, in some sense, anti-sex. It's something else, which is sort of interesting to me. I mean, it comes in the 20th century, the first century evangelical Christians think about anti-sex in a complicated way, but that's not the story I'm telling. So that's visiting what I've done before with some glosses on where I've been before. So let me now revisit it, if you will, and look at it. So one important revisiting or reconsideration comes from Barbara Taylor, who reviewed the book in the London Review of Books. And who pointed out that solitary fantasy was widely regarded with particular anxiety as conducive, quotes Johnson, the invisible rod of the mind, sequel prodigality of being. Fly from yourself, he advised, solitary fantasies, lest you succumb to inner delight, which and the only to speak were more tempting than anything real could offer. So it's this danger of the unreal. And she then pushes it back to the connection of dangers, pathologies of solitude, to religious contexts. One could go back in monastic contexts and a rabbinic context in which solitary reading, the solitary study of text was frowned upon. One read texts in common with people, and what still does do in Jewish communities. One reads it with a rabbi. Monastic communities read books together. So the idea of reading by oneself obviously had a danger, all sorts of dangers, but this was recognized for a long time. But Barbara makes an interesting point. Let me just read it. Anxiety is about autoeroticism played an important part in these beliefs, the beliefs of pathologies of self, not just an accusation of witchcraft, but they were taken in very different terms later on. Such anxieties were unavoidable. Loving God is the key, this is Barbara's words, loving God is the key Christian duty, but the intensity of transcendent passion in some believers, the torrent of pleasure for the most voluptuous, and she quotes Jeremy Taylor's best-selling Rule and Exercise of Holy Living, which is published in 1650, but gets republished endlessly. A mighty ecstasy, a bliss completely full, in the words of the 1690 poet Elizabeth Rowell. So the Protestant emphasis on inner divinity, on private experience as a touchstone of moral truth, heightened the dilemma. How does distinguish sacred love from the profane variety? Jeremy Taylor summed up the problem. This is still Barbara. Our vices, he wrote, are in love with phantasmic pleasures and images of perfection, which are truly really to be found nowhere but in God. Make sure your devotions are prudent and without illusion, believers were warned, unlike these mystics who at Christ are the look that Epicurus in their heart. So there's a sense in which this is a danger that comes from solitude, especially solitude, which generates issues of desire, either desire for God, or in the masturbation case, desire for pleasures procured normally only through intercourse of the sexes, as he puts it. The common thread I want to suggest, and what Barbara cites and what I cite, is the isomorphism between too much solitude with God, which is in some sense to say God without a governor, if we think of solitary prayer as a potentially overheated steam engine, and too much solitude with a secular inflamed imagination. Or this is a revisiting question. The lesson is not to make so much of a distinction between the secular and the religious categories of solitude. That brings in religion more generally. I took this to be a secular guilt. That is, it's a guilt born not of a violation of God's law, but something else. Hence the particular objection, which I take to be a secular concept. I don't think, in reflection, that I took seriously enough the language of sin and guilt in Onania. And I sort of acquit myself of this failure, in part because the Enlightenment figures right Freud didn't. And because initially I was interested in physical advice rather than the spiritual advice that he wants to give. And because Renaissance porn, and of course later Sod, can be seen as an explicit attack on religion. So I wanted to see all this as sort of external to religion. But this is what the actual tract said. Spiritual advice to those who have already injured themselves by this abominable practice. And the spiritual advice is the following: it's to repent with a grief. I'm quoting now Onania. Enters deep and pierces the very heart, filling it with sadness and remorse, detestation and fear, that the sinner finds no longer any pleasure and satisfaction in the things he had formerly delighted in, but seeks to withdraw and get out of the way of them, and finds more comfort in his sadness and tears for them. So in some sense, I hadn't seen the kind of spiritual version that he saw, mainly because, as I said, the high Enlightenment texts tend to see this as this moral physical pathology. It's been almost nothing on redemption. I mean, Kant doesn't say make it better, so doesn't say, and neither does blood. So in other words, I think thinking more about it, I would tie it more to this idea, perhaps, to the sort of Christian problem of guilt, which grows out of concupiscence as the mark in the body of the estrangement of the soul from God, and the primal reminder of sin, as Augustine discusses in The City of God and other places. So that's the religious part. The other thing that I haven't really figured out is this connection to objection and to the monstrous. So Kant connects it to self-murder as worse than self-murder. But you also find, and I that in the remake of Hitchcock's Psycho, for example, the killer, Norman Bates, does something extra. That is, he masturbates before he murders. So there's something sinister about masturbation. Not that masturbation in someone's pregnant is so great, but that it's so connected with the violence and with murder seems to me sort of interesting. So the guilt, then, I don't know how to handle this issue of guilt and objection historically. It's the foundation of web communities of hundreds of thousands of men who try to support each other now to remain masturbation free. If you go on the web, you'll find communities that number in 10 to the 6th or 10 to the 7th, which take guilt and objection. Recently, the Wittgenstein diaries were published, translated, and Wittgenstein goes on and on about this the guilt of this act. And I don't quite get it, because I can't figure out what to say about this in the context that I had put in. Manifestly, it's understood as a pathology of solitude in the context of solitary sex, but it ends up being sort of solitude creating a version of self-loathing. And it's possible that alcoholism came to be a word, as I say, just a little bit later, than onanism. So there's some version in which connection of self-loathing and addiction is tied together. So as I say, a loss of self, which produces then this feeling of objection. In any case, that's the religious part and the monstrous objection part. The religious part, I think there is a real historical isomorphism on the hand between a religious community that's increasingly independent, where believers are sort of independent and a community in which the state has less and less control over some issues of gets out of the sexuality business. Kosher story. That this objection I don't quite get. The last point I want to connect it to is the history of pornography. Onania was softcore porn. In other words, what the actual stories are is, I was visiting with my older cousin and we were in bed together and she showed me a way to get pleasure, and then that was so great. Then I did such and such, and so and then there's another one, and then I was cured by taking this drug, and so forth and so on. And it grew from issue to issue, from the short 70 or 80 page track through the 400-page track, but all with these sort of softcore porn stories. So it was the incitement of desire to produce a disease, which you then at the end found out where you could buy this up to fix your disease. So it's softcore porn. So this pathology of solitude is born with, and at the same time is sustained by a marketing quite bad. Rousseau makes it explicit in the Confessions. It's porn or books to be read with one hand. So that's not so. So porn. Okay, so porn is, I thought, sort of quintessentially a literature of solitude. At least it is, the vast majority of it is. And it's exploded logarithmically in the last decades from what it was already a vast literary world. There was obviously earlier porn in Aretino and that tradition, but it's my reading, it was quite different than this porn, as is the erotic pictures in Pompeii and so forth. It's not the self-absorptive engine of desire that this porn benefits. So the point is, it's a literature of unreality in the way that masturbation is construed as unreal. It's a version of unmoored sex. It's unmoored from the social world. And that may be the root of the objection that so many report, and the guilt that so many report in their relationship both to porn and to masturbation. My wife, Carla, has reminded me of a section in Victor Brombaer's autobiography where he speaks about what's wrong with a boy losing his virginity with a prostitute. It models or it prefigures the sex as disconnected to an actual human relationship. And that, of course, harkens back to prostitution as the social evil, or you want to say better, the antisocial evil of the 19th century, which is precisely with this connection of sex with the social role. But I don't want to argue the point about Robert's point, the prostitution in particular, but I think I could take Robert's point and end with that in some sense they lived and we live in this world of an incitement to desire, which seems to be unending and geometrically exploding, and its connections to sex, well, either in a social sense or in the moral sense, which we talked about before, are sort of unclear and problematic. And I think that's the age that we're living in now, and that's as far as I'm going to revisit it. So,
Thank you very much. Okay, everyone. So we're back. Unmuted. Yes, that's right. Unmuted. Our friends online, and we want to have a period of questions. Half an hour or so, and I thought I could begin with the first one, and it's about the 1712, that afternoon when onanism was invented, which I find a very, very attractive idea, because not only was it 1712, and I've worked a lot on 1712, but I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about what's the advantage of having such a specific date, and given that, as the book also explains in great detail, you're not making any claim that there wasn't masturbation before that. There was since time out of mind. Right. Masturbation has been around, and so what kind of change is it that's happening in 1712? And the example, when I was reading it this afternoon, I was drawn back to your examples from Pepys, for example, who clearly masturbates privately and apparently publicly in church. And in some senses, that is because he's writing it in the diary, he's certainly not concerned about the moral consequences of that. But he is maybe, and also maybe there is a kind of guilt in the way that he writes. Whenever he does anything like that, he writes it in Italian, in the shorthand he's using, so that it's doubly coded. And I wonder, so that there's a kind of secrecy to that, which he doesn't treat it as the same as other experiences that he's having.
It's interesting. So when he talks about these different people he has sex with, he doesn't do anything code.
Yes, yeah. Everything to do with sex is
encoded. Right, so heterosexual. Right.
Double
right. Well, that sort of makes the point. In other words, Pepys is delighted when he has sex with someone before me, or just all the time. He's constantly around, and he's pleased with himself when he can have an orgasm without actually touching himself. He gets so excited, and he loves it when he goes to, Catholic services occasionally, which are really splendid in their sensuousness, and he can get off on just watching it. So he thinks it's just another version of sexual adventure. The reason that it's 1712 is it actually is 1712. I mean, it could be 1708. We tried to say 1712, and I just it was just stunning. And well, that's one reason. But the other reason is that all my sources refer back to 1712. And when you look at the encyclopedia, it says, "Isn't it amazing that this quack started this thing with no one noticed before?" Tissot, this extremely learned Protestant doctor in Geneva, says, my book's nothing like this book, of course, but this was the book that discovered it. So I thought, well, look, it actually is the case, and so I needed this. And you have the occasional reference before it, as you know, if you read the book there. I tried to find the occasional person who works about this in 1680 something. I mean, you can find a mention or two. But by the 18th century, this is everywhere in all the right places. And by the 19th century, you start looking at these high medical encyclopedias, will have 20 pages. I mean, the Science Médicale has a section on this with 200 citations going back to the 18th century. So that's, which is stunning.
It all go back to Narnia.
It also go back to Narnia. So it just seemed to me, okay, it's mysterious, it's weird. Let's say it's completely strange. I know no other track that has this kind of, and so in some sense, if you ask me what is the infrastructure for, well, it's your story. It's these coffee houses and commercial, commercial sales of medicine, and we can trace the roots. But that track should take off. It's also well done. It's better than Aeronautica. Aeronautica be considered. I mean, it is a kind of, it's a well done piece of softcore porn. But that's not like, it's like explaining why a movie takes off. No one seems to know what makes a movie succeed. This just took off. So that's why I was sort of committed to that date, because they were so committed to that date. That makes sense? And they thought it was, so I thought I needed to stick to that.
Trio of hands went for exactly the same. Suzanne, I think, was slightly ahead. Matt was slightly ahead.
Well, we were just talking about this, but I was wondering about exhibitionism and voyeurism and where that fits into the story. So, the person looking through the peephole, pleasuring themselves, or the idea of doing it kind of in front of a spectacle, watching someone, which isn't exactly solitary, but it is secret or kind of hidden. Or in fact, Scott just gave me a great example, Leopold Bloom in so isn't entirely solitary. It's not.
There's almost nothing of this in this literature.
Sorry?
I mean, there's almost nothing of this
Right.
in the literature of the 19th century. It's obviously part of modern porn and part of the history of voyeurism. But there's a certain amount of this. Schoolboys doing it, schoolgirls doing it. So there's a kind of getting off together, which is a kind of social problem, but it's not the voyeuristic part. It's the communal, where it's not exactly solitary. But even then, they emphasize that everyone does this in their own head. So you're absolutely right, and that's an important part of the story and how that develops as a particular form of voyeurism, rather than the word, which is different than the voyeurism of heterosexual or any kind of intercourse for that matter. So it's an interesting question, but it's not in the literature. It's not in any of these texts. It's not in. So it's surprising. I haven't thought about that. That's right. But it's not, because they were so interested in this individual pathology that the social. I mean, I suspect my guess would be that they think doing it exhibitionistically would be better than doing it otherwise. Well, I mean, I meant that because some cop could come along and say, "Don't do it."
Yeah.
I mean, there was so point that Emile says is that it's secret and therefore it's inaccessible to social mediation. While exhibitionism, someone will stop you. I think that would be if you ask Rousseau, why is exhibitionism less dangerous than solitary sex? My guess is that's the answer he would give.
Yeah. It's a transgression that might be it's a transgression that might be caught out, or kind of
right.
It's like a violation of
There are those collective masturbatory practices in 18th century clubs like the
Medmenham. Those crazy. What's it called?
the beggar's benefit.
The beggar's benefit. I reviewed the beggar's benefit for the English Historical Review. The hot temple of nerdy British historical studies, right? The most conservative journal around. I thought it was a fraud. I mean, I thought someone, I was sort of like the what was the guy who wrote the postmodern article? Physicists who wrote the postmodern article. What? So the so-called story, and foisted it on Keith Barlow. I think it was Keith Barlow, one of these, Homo magazines, and it was a fake. I thought that someone was faking this. So I actually wrote this guy Edwards. Is this for real? I mean, what do I know? It turns out these archives exist. So I couldn't believe it. You guys know about this club? It's the club of these guys in the Nook of Fife, in the Freud, who had this club where they got together, and I think they had prostitutes on occasion, but basically they masturbated together in this bowl. I mean, it's kind of, so you're right, there is this communal.
The Knights of Bedlam have this similar.
Right, so that has this kind of, you said it was like between men.
Yeah.
But that's, again, there's relatively little of this in this. I mean, what I call it was solitary sex. It was a solitary part. That's what's interesting to me. It wasn't simply like the Monks Amendment it's a word, can't think of the word. So erotic plus amendment is a word for it. Anyway, I can't think. Libertinism. It wasn't just the version. It wasn't just a version. It's not a version of libertinism. It's a different social and more dangerous social pathology with libertinism, according to these guys. Well, I don't think the Monks Amendment and the look of how these people and these issues in France at the same time were really, by and large, aristocratic upper middle class, and not understood to be quite as, I think, outrageous, but not corrosively, not morally corrosive. Would be my,
they didn't think of themselves as morally corrosive,
right?
Even though they were.
And even the enemies didn't think of it more. They thought it was terrible, but not like this.
Matt.
Thank you. I've got a question that's it's kind of methodological. It's kind of, I've been thinking about this this idea of pornography and the place of the different kinds of texts that you've got for your argument. And I suppose I find it really, really interesting and useful to have lots of different kinds of texts that look like they're participating in different sorts of discourses and they seem to be talking about the same thing. So I like your response to Barbara's talk, this discussion of religion and how that kind of proceeds. I suppose what I'm interested in is, given that there's so much taboo that might be sort of preventing people talking about various different practices, such as this club that maybe doesn't get discussed in the injunctions against masturbation, possibly because it might give people ideas as much as because it's not the same issue, if you see what I mean. Given that it's taboo governing both the religious and the scientific and all of those things, and then part of your other series of texts are broadly what you're defining as pornographic, i.e. aids to masturbation. How do you deal with the sort of historiographical problem of pornography being such a kind of unstable category? I mean, we kind of think in the 20th century we've got D.H. Lawrence's novel that goes to court about to what extent it's pornography, and the question of whether something's pornography seems to go down to something about reader response, or kind of what it's a very complicated kind of question, and I guess that's always been the case. And just thinking about how do you determine whether something you talked about a medical discourse being pornographic because you just decided it was, and I was kind of like, how do you decide whether something's pornographic? Given that they don't advertise as pornographic, and also, sorry, just briefly. Yeah. And this is not a hostile question. This is just I'd love you to just explain what you're talking about. I find it really fascinating. What do you think is the difference then between do you think there is a difference between pornography that is an image and between pornography which uses text, but with both of those, do you think, and narrative, do you think these can all be lumped together as the same thing, and can we look at this across time and kind of easily kind of pinpoint these things?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, we would now say that some of these Fardanar paintings of with the black dog in her lap, or even worse, half naked woman dishabilate with a dog there is a quote self-pornographic version, and then more explicit versions of this in radical cartoons, in which the dog is actually engaged to sex toy. So, but I think the porn, well, I at least look, that's it. I just don't know enough about the history of visual porn and how, but this seems to be, they worry about novels, and they worry about endless reproduction of late 18th century stuff with explicitly porn, the nun, the cloister, which gets endlessly printed in all conceivable languages. And Cleveland, of course, there's I mean, Mark will know more about this than I do, but there's the old pornography, which gets reprinted. Then French porn that gets produced, it's a radical tradition that Hunt and Darwin talk about, gets translated and sent. And my sense is that explicitly pictorial porn is a function of photography, but I could be wrong about that. But it's not one of these things in which, the Supreme Court's trying to decide, our Supreme Court trying to decide whether Ulysses is pornographic or not. I mean, the stuff is pornographic, and it's meant to be pornographic. Writing about property in a sort of technical sense of
So
writing a harlot. I mean, it's meant. Yeah, I mean, I think the category of books we read with one hand. There's a French guy named Gaudissart wrote a book called Books We Read with One Hand, which gets the title from Rousseau. So clearly there was this genre of books which were not subtly, like, as you say, judged. It was born, and it was meant to be inciting, and that's the history of this vast explosion of porn on the. I mean, it's the most watched thing on the internet. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I mean, when I last looked at this, which was not long ago, porn was still vastly outnumbered sites on cats and cosmetics and even people who have phones and from people. So it really is that. But the visual is a really interesting story. I don't know. We do get huge numbers of porn pictures by the by the 1870s. That's a whole genre.
Scott.
I really enjoyed the talk as well. And like Suzanne, I work on modernist literature, so I was instantly trying to think of examples of masturbation in modernist literature. But actually, I hit on one, and then I remembered that new women fiction is often in the 1880s and 1890s, new women writers and the new woman herself is often accused of explicitly or implicitly of autoeroticism. And I think the frontispiece by Aubrey Beardsley of George Edgerton's Keynotes has a woman with her hand in her crotch, and then Aubrey Beardsley's illustrations generally of Salome or of people are usually masturbating, although they're usually watching somebody else masturbating as well as masturbating at the same time. But long story short, the example I was thinking of was Dorothy Richardson's Pilgrimage. And in the second volume of that, Miriam Henderson is teaching in a school in North London where she's extremely depressed. And the way she sort of tries to capture time for herself is by reading at night, reading popular fiction from a popular library at night. And the focus is on her hands, which are extremely large, and she's embarrassed about and feels that they're not really part of her conventional feminine self. And queer critics like Mandy Merck and Jo Winning have read this as a masturbation scene. But what seems to me interesting is that feminist and queer critics have usually read the scene as a redemptive one in which she is gaining some bodily but also social autonomy. And this is both in terms of the reading, but also in terms of the time that she takes. So she's not sleeping. So she's taking time away from her work, which is caring work. So she's choosing not to care for others, but to be for herself. As well as possibly masturbating at the same time. And yet her hands are both hers and not hers, because they are these big masculine working hands. So somehow they represent her labor coming back and pleasuring her. I'm not quite sure how it works, but it just seems to me that maybe there is a shift in understanding of female masturbation at the end of the 19th century, the end of the 20th century, where it becomes potentially a feminist redemptive practice.
It's really interesting. I mean, I don't know the text. I mean, in the 1960s, that's explicit. I mean, our bodies ourselves, says what you just said, and speaks of masturbation as owning its own body. And there's a whole literature about that. But it will be really interesting to see what. I mean, I don't know anything between 1890 and 1960. I mean, you know, and that kept, so it was really interesting to look at that as a part of feminist self-possession, because then it becomes huge. As a quite explicit in that tract and laid out, so in a whole bunch of places, at least in American feminism. It's a good thing. Sex shops, operators, there's a whole world which is about self-possession. But so
That makes me then wonder whether it is actually there, or whether it's a second wave feminist reading it early.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know the text, but it would be interesting to find out. We read these texts in an intense way to see about sexual self-possession.
Mm.
I don't wish I knew more. I mean, I don't know the text. I mean, it sounds intriguing to me.
There was one question from the online watchers, from Alan Walker. He says, perhaps beyond the topic, but wondering about sex magic and occult literature and possible links with Oriental ideas, which also, if I can add an extra bit onto the end of that. I was really intrigued with what you said about how, you know, onania is a Grub Street production.
Right.
And yet emerges into medical orthodoxy within 50 years.
And moral, yeah.
It grows in length and
Right.
seriousness. Does it do that? It does that in Britain and France and North America, but when and how does it do it globally? Like, when does masturbation become global?
Well, you probably know the answer. It's the history of imperialism. So where the Chinese get it, it's in Singapore, it's in Hong Kong. So it's translated to these languages. It's in Calcutta, it's in Manila. It sort of follows the Western bourgeois story, and then in China you start getting novels about masturbation in the centuries. So it's a Western version, is what I could tell. That makes its way through empire. And so it's translated to 20-some languages, some of them being Western languages, but a lot of them being languages of the rest of the world. So that's it's Westernizing, and it's urban Europe as well, for that matter. All these cases are it follows coffee houses. I mean, it does, you know, it follows these networks, these commercial philosophy. Answer question.
I guess, you know, as I'm listening again, I'm wondering about whether it sort of maps onto the history of privacy or solitude in a pretty big way, and that we have a new technology not printed in the market that produces spaces that, you know, allow people to move outside of the regulatory infrastructure of previous social, you know, it's not print, because print has been recaptured by the state and by the church for its own purposes. And so I think it is the market that's the ability to have commercial access to print rather than print itself. That's the crucial sort of producer of the anxiety and also the opportunity. And I'm wondering if, in some weird way, the web is a new moment in that. You get technology in this case, or new liberal forms of deregulation that also allow people to escape out of, and the anxiety is about escape out of these, you know, relatively regulated spaces. My question of it is kind of following up on what you just said is, you know, the Chinese have a highly commercialized society much earlier, in fact, than Europeans. It would really be interesting to have a conversation, a kind of comparative, at least, conversation with scholars of Chinese sexuality, history of Chinese sexuality about this, because I think you probably could then answer the question about whether this is, in some ways, as you put it, either doppelganger or a symptom of, the production of a mechanism of social exchange, the commercial market, that allows human desire to escape a previous regulatory framework. And maybe the 19th century begins slowly to close that, nail it down, and maybe some of you in these 20th century novels are about nailing people back into channeling that energy in particular ways that then get burst open again.
Well, I guess
The 70s.
when I looked into this and even subsequently, I tried to, and I couldn't find literature. Because obviously, Ayurvedic medicine is full of issues of seminal loss,
Right.
but in Chinese medicine as well. But that's a different, all sorts of ways of seminal loss. It doesn't apply to women, so it's a different sort of issue. What I would say is novel about the European context of the 17th, 18th century is this extraordinary emphasis on an autonomous self. And what people famously say about the Chinese, they do medical ethics is now we have this notion of patient autonomy. The Chinese don't have a notion of patient autonomy. There's a family sciences issues. And there's big tensions about families get furious in California, that part of the world, in which doctors start asking the actual ill person what their views are, rather than asking the family what their views are. So my sense of this would be that it doesn't arise in these other places in the world until some sort of Western ideas of breaking off from communal structures and family structures rise, and it starts being an autonomous individual who then has to be fashioned and socialized. And that would be my answer. And that story happens in imperial contexts. And P.S. there's a dog version of this, and the Japanese have no interest in dogs until the opening of Japan, and the rise of sort of Western bourgeois habits. And then all of a sudden you start finding dogs all over Japanese pictures and prints, and you know what I mean. So it is a function of a particular Western account of an individual, the creatures and the individual, their sexuality rather than the community. That would be my response. When I look, but as you know, I tried to talk to our colleagues about China and India and Japan, and there is no equivalent, even though with Japanese print culture is very far advanced, the European culture in its massiveness and its distributed networks and so forth. So it's not just print. Print is a necessary in the West, but not sufficient. It should
Got Dominic,
Yeah.
and Stephanie, and there's one more online, and then we'll call it a night.
So my ears pricked up at the beginning when you mentioned Vito Acconci's seedbed. So
Yeah.
Masturbation ground. And then you made a reference to another work, which is the Chris Burden work of him through the broken glass, which is interestingly called Through the Night Softly. Which,
that's an interesting slip on my part.
yeah,
right?
when you put them together, the title sort of sounds a bit masturbatory as well. But what I was wondering is that the seedbed is often read as a kind of act of violence against the people who are sort of above him, who he sort of fantasizes about the people traversing the sculptural sort of slanted object, therefore kind of reintroducing the body and desire and all the kind of messy bits of embodiment that have been so sort of brutally or conveniently removed from the development of form of sculpture in the 1960s. So like, what do you think was being invoked in that opening preamble, where you invoke the body seemingly returning in a very visceral way, so not the image but the actual body masturbating in the room? What do you think? What were you?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that I made the slip trying to the objective of Burden and Acconci. I mean, that was a let's breathe.
Right.
I mean, you'd want to make that interesting act of aggression. I mean, do they know he's down there doing this? They don't. They know he's.
So there's a sort of sound.
They know he's down
relay,
there doing right.
Yeah.
That he's doing the sound,
and he's responding to the sort of vibration of people
I think,
wandering around.
thinking what's happening.
Mhm.
What do I make of that? Well, I mean, I suppose what's interesting to me again is with all this is why is this particular act become an act that's so how to put it, artistically, viscerally powerful?
Mhm.
I mean, and it's differently powerful than shooting yourself or tying yourself up. I mean, all the other acts of conceptual art with the body. And that's why I brought this up more at a puzzlement than out of an answer. And that speaks to this abjection story generally. I mean, it seems to be probably marked, sexual category, whether aggressive or whether mocking. So I brought it up evocatively, not because I have a big answer to it, but this my slip into the Chris Burden end of, but now I think of these other versions would be that it is tied up to something that's abject in a way that intercourse on stage wouldn't be, or intercourse under a table wouldn't be, right? And that's what sort of strikes me as I'm puzzled by, and I don't have a real historical account for this, except to say that it seems to have this long subterranean history, that he must be playing into. I mean, I evoked it rather than I shouldn't have. I mentioned it rather than used it. These portrait Russell distinction. We should have made it.
Stephanie.
Okay. Oh, you haven't finished.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I thought Mark was going to talk to me on the screen, so I'm sorry.
Oh,
But
okay.
take Stephanie first.
Yeah, okay. I did have a vanilla question, which was about what you change if you did a revised edition. But now you've mentioned dogs twice, I'm going to have to talk about it. So I obviously it's something I thought about a lot. The dog thing, dog porn.
Yeah.
And I went to talk at ASEX, online at ASEX a few years ago, and there's a woman, a scholar, talking about the lapdog mistress lyric tradition, and she presented it as a kind of a queer formation of love. And I've been thinking back a lot, because obviously there are two kinds of dog porn. There's dogs that feature masturbation in two ways, right? One as a kind of softcore porn thing, like the Diablo corpse, that you've got that horrendous picture in your book of the woman with the dog, right? And on the other hand, as kind of masturbatory aids. And I don't know, I was wondering what you thought of that, because to me, it seems like the dog always, it's a way of talking about women masturbating without actually talking about them masturbating. Because in those poems, it's always like, oh, she's asleep, the dog crawls up, oh, she's dreaming about her lover, and then suddenly the dog's performing cunnilingus, then she's had an orgasm, and then she's killed the dog, right? Like, are you familiar with that poem?
Yes.
Yeah, so I don't know, I want, because obviously this ties solitary sex to the project you're working on now, right, which is a dog project. And I just wondered do you see dogs as potentially queer lovers, like in this one configuration, or are they masturbatory age, or is there something between?
Well,
and then
look,
how
it's a good question. It's interesting, it's dogs and not cats, which are technically the usual animal or female sexuality, which are actually not that much in art, truth be told. Yeah. So I'm thinking more rather than the explicit picture of masturbatory aids that you see in some of these high art. It's more these pictures of someone swooning. There's a love letter in their hand. They're completely slightly late. They're reading something, and there's a dog in her lap. And so I make the association between this warm, cuddly thing in her lap, is reading this letter. So it's not explicitly masturbatory, but it's some sort of connection between this lap creature, lap, reading, exhaustion. That's rather. So you're right, and I don't know about the porn. Dog and then killing them. I don't, and I'm not sure I want to know. I deal with fiction, died and acting, and I try to stay.
It's a very polite.
It's another. I mean, I'd be interested if you hear this world, then maybe I'll say something about it, but I'm trying to move away from sex in this talk.
Yeah, no,
You know, and death, I'm trying
You're
to,
involving,
I'm going in a new
yeah.
direction, if you
Yeah.
will. Telling the truth. You were-
Okay, so should we take the final question, which is from Miles online. What is the class position of the target of this, and how does that change over the 18th and 19th century? Sounds like it starts as a bourgeois concern, but does it then slide down the social scale?
It does. And that's why you get all this sort of the Boy Scouts trying to recruit working class kids, and the Boy Scout becomes so virulently anti-masturbatory. So I think it's absolutely right. It starts with the class of people who buy these kind of tracts. But by the late 19th century, also the working class are buying things like Aristotle's masterpiece, which is this, you know, late 17th century, whatever it is, fake sex guide, which is, I mean, it was still being sold in Manchester when I was a grad student. Yeah, you can still buy it. I mean, the kind of covertness of sex when I was a grad, you see with your haircut, and the guy who asked you, says, unless you need. And we condoms, and you ask, you know, we really had this kind of, no, just the haircut works. But what I guess I'm saying, so it becomes the kind of these revisits of these late 19th, people study this, the history of Aristotle's masterpiece, these late 17th tracts, which then hear more about masturbation in the 18th century, are still circulating in working class communities in the 20th century. So I guess I would say he's absolutely right. That it starts out as a bourgeois concern for the kind of people who buy medicines at coffee houses, and then it becomes a much wider concern for those people who need to be morally redeemed, like the kids who join the Boy Scouts or go to camps in other countries, and it becomes a general feature. It goes down the social scale as a version of people who need to be prevented from seriously harming themselves.
Great. Okay, well, I think we've been torturing Tom for long enough, so we can we'll say goodbye to our online
Thank you, guys.
friends, and we can continue to have a glass of wine and talk for a bit longer. So thanks everyone online.